Servus Freunde, my name is Jimmy Cage. Jimmy, du musst mir helfen! Who are you? Ich bin du! Ich bin Jimmy! Jimmy aus der Zukunft! Wir müssen Martha retten! Why is it always the name Martha? And why are you talking in German? And what happened to my eye? And why am I missing an arm? All deine Fragen werden beantwortet, wenn die Zeit gekommen ist. Screw that mystery nonsense. I want my answers now. Okay, pass auf. Die Sache mit dem Auge. Servus Freunde, my name is Jimmy Cage and as you know, normally I don't review series. There's just so much amazing stuff you can watch and I can barely keep up with just the movies that I want to watch and also all the movies that get recommended to us. So adding series on top of that is not really possible from a time aspect alone. But pun intended, for Dark I made the time and I even watched the first 2 seasons 2 times. More or less in a row, or at least with very little time between my first and second watch. Which should already tell you that I think that it's a very special creation. Yet it was still absolutely possible that the third and final season that was just released on Netflix last Saturday could drive everything completely against the wall. In the last years we witnessed several big and beloved franchises that couldn't quite stick the landing or even went down in flames. Now of course in the end it's also all highly subjective and it's always up to you how satisfied or disappointed you are with something. But from the first reactions that I saw and of course more important to me, my own subjective feeling, Dark, now that it's all wrapped up and done, is a damn good show. Now, before I share my take with you, I think it's important to let you know how I intend to do this review. Dark has an immensely invested fan community and with almost 200,000 votes on the IMDb, I think you can't quite call it a cult show anymore. But still I believe it's still something that a lot more people should learn about and explore for themselves. And therefore I first want to talk a little bit about the show and what it does so well without really getting into many spoilers. Of course with a mystery show like this that isn't easy, but I think it's possible to some degree and hopefully people who stumble on this review might want to check out the series for themselves. But of course then I want to go into the heart and soul of it and also talk about its finale. The entire series can now be watched on Netflix and since we live in a time of binge watching, I assume most people who watch this review have already seen the entire series. But first, spoiler free. Here's why you should watch Dark. Dark is a German science fiction mystery drama series that was created by the couple Baran Odar and Jantje Friese. There are 26 episodes in total divided into 3 seasons and it's best to watch them all in a very narrow time span, because it's easily one of the most complex and intricate works of fiction ever created. At first it might appear similar to Netflix's other big mystery series Stranger Things, both dealing with a bunch of adolescents and strange occurrences in a small town, and both of them came out within a year of each other, but that first impression is just that and not more, because Dark is its own unique monster and goes to very different places. Without doing it justice, it might be described as a combination of Stranger Things, Twin Peaks, Black Mirror and the dark twisted vibe you get from a David Fincher film, with the mindfuck of a Christopher Nolan and all of it times 10 maybe. It takes place in a small fictitious town of Winden, and at first it seems to be the story about the aftermath of a child's disappearance. But Dark isn't a normal police procedural or family drama or mystery horror series, and at this point, even if you haven't seen the series, it's not really a spoiler anymore, but there is time travel involved. And at the end of episode 2, the missing child, a young boy named Mikkel, arrives in the year 1986, and of course the first 2 people he meets by chance are his own future parents. But Dark isn't some light-hearted Back to the Future sci-fi comedy either, and it treats time travel very differently. And to see and try to understand how it does that is one of the biggest joys as well as one of the biggest mindfucks you can imagine. If you're interested in such concepts like time travel and watch it play out in a remarkable, philosophical and semi-realistic fashion, Dark is the show for you. And I say semi-realistic because Dark tries to stay as close as possible to what is there in theoretical physics, quantum mechanics, general relativity and so on. Of course with some artistic freedoms here and there and of course in the means of telling a great story and exploring different themes. Hence science fiction. Whenever we deal with time travel to the past, we deal with questions about the possible changes those journeys will cause, and it more or less always leads to certain paradoxes. Going back to the past and accidentally killing your own grandfather, or becoming the reason why you are getting born in the first place. Ideas that appear to make no sense or simply can't be, or at least can't be fathomed. Dark's complex connections and its web of cause and effect seems to start rather simple, with Mikkel going back to the 1980s and therefore changing the course of that world. But for those who haven't seen the series, I can tell you that it's only the beginning and you have really no idea at all where this will all lead to. Dark isn't just next level when it comes to time travel fiction, it jumps several levels ahead and established itself as the ultimate time travel show. And with a concept this delicate and susceptible to dozens of plot holes, it must be said how meticulously everything was planned by the creators, which is a major reason why the show became this beloved by fans and why it was also able to stick the landing. With movie trilogies and long format narrations, we always like to think or hope that there was at least some kind of overarching plan in motion. We like to think that Kevin Feige had most of the MCU laid out, or that showrunners know the final destination even though their story is just about to begin. I think in general it's a good idea to have a plan, but I would also argue that it's not a must for any form of storytelling, and there are a lot of examples with no full-fledged plan in motion where a story organically evolved and where the end wasn't formed beforehand. Unfortunately, the new Star Wars trilogy wasn't such a case, and in the end it was a pretty big and frustrating mess. And many years ago, when I was pretty hooked on Lost, it also became clearer and clearer with each new season how much of it just went nowhere and how much it depended on rather random mysteries. You can argue that it's always more about the characters and the journey, but with Lost I was extremely infuriated towards the end. Dark, on the other hand, was very carefully planned from the get-go, and before season 2 was even released, it was already announced that it would be 3 seasons in total. Somehow they were even able to pull off that release dates of season 2 and 3 were woven into the narrative of the show itself, with the release date of season 2 being a very crucial day in the storyline and the one of season 3 being shown on the page of an important notebook in the show that states the date of the third and final cycle. I still remember how surprised I was to find out that the show paid attention to a little detail like a scar on some person in season 1 that makes sense when we see how that person got that scar in season 2. It was already there, and that was when I was completely reassured that I was in the hands of great storytellers who put all their passion and effort into this project. And while we still move in rather spoiler-free territory, I want to talk about how marvelous the presentation is and how cleverly Dark unfolds its story. First, the presentation. With all 26 episodes being directed by Baran Odar and the same creative team behind all 3 seasons, you get a very distinct and completely consistent look and feel. The cinematography was done by Nikolaus Summerer and the music composed by Ben Frost, and both are of utmost importance for the show's dark, brooding and very sad vibe. It literally is a very dark show with almost no humor to be found at all, and the beautiful but often sparse images, the restrained color palette and the heavy, sometimes almost suffocating, devastating music create this sad and fucked up but nevertheless very immersive world of loss and despair, but also hope and deep felt bonds between the characters. A factor that can be applauded more is the phenomenal casting. In a show about time travel, you will see many characters at different ages in their lives, and as a filmmaker you have to think about the way you pull that off. Do you go with the same actors and try to make them appear younger and older depending on the time period? Do you do this by makeup, or do you apply digital effects? Especially the latter becomes ever more popular and advanced with movies like The Irishman or Captain Marvel. Dark doesn't do that. It relies on classic makeup effects for some instances, but most of it all relies on casting. On casting different actors for the same character in different time periods, and I highly doubt that there was ever a work of fiction that did it better than Dark. The resemblances are remarkable, and you always believe that it has to be the same character, even though 2 or more different actors are playing the same role. And in a series that features so many different characters, that's just an incredible achievement. But its biggest achievement in my mind is not just the way it is able to tell its deeply intertwined story, but the fact that Baran Odar and Jantje Friese were able to come up with something like this in the first place and push it to the level they did. I know it's maybe not always the best benchmark, but when something is as simple or predictable and familiar that I think I could have written that, it always shrinks significantly in my estimation. Which shouldn't mean that simple things can't be great. Quite the opposite. Something clear and focused is usually something I admire a lot. Dark plays at the other end of that spectrum. This is such a clusterfuck, but a clusterfuck that somehow almost magically works, without there being any noticeable plot holes or anything like that. It is such a dense and complicated narrative, or more so a complicated form of storytelling because of the time travel element, that it's hard for me to believe how anybody was able to imagine and write this. But it has been done, and the result is simply remarkable. And for me to describe what I find so clever about its storytelling is to go a step towards more spoiler-heavy territory. Still not yet full spoiler, but a little bit more, and if you're still not convinced yet to give the show a try, you can keep on listening to what I think about it, but you have been warned about some mild spoilers. Dark classifies as what is often called a slow burn. A drama, a mystery, a conflict that plays out in very carefully orchestrated slow strokes. Something that takes time to unravel and that immerses the audience into its world and problems. Something that's rather low on actual action, but that is able to deliver gut punches and is able to really resonate nevertheless. And Dark does an incredible job in ever increasing the scope of what the actual fuck is going on in Winden and how far and how deep all the connections reach. The first season starts almost normal, and one of the show's accomplishments lies in its rather realistic portrayal of time travel and how people in the real world would react to its existence. That doesn't mean that Dark isn't a very stylized show, not just in the way it creates this dark and melancholic mood, but also when it comes to its symbolism, which can be regarded as one of the show's strengths and one of its most memorable aspects, but that can also work a little bit to its detriment, but I will talk about that later in the full spoiler segment. But the characters are all grounded in reality and feel extremely authentic. Minus the complete lack of humor, but that's just how they wanted to tell the story, and it fits the seriousness and world-weary tone. But it also feels real because it starts out rather small, with a missing child, or rather several missing child cases, and even the first time travel that is depicted is easy to grasp. But slowly and steady, Dark adds more and more layers. So many layers that you can't not pay attention at any given moment if you want to be able to follow the story and its many characters. And before we know it, this isn't just about time travel between the present and the 1980s, and the 50s are thrown into the mix as well. And with several different time periods and a big ensemble cast, one of the most important questions is how to tell this story. How do you tell a story about time travel in a medium that is characterized by the progression of linear and forward-moving time? By the nature of its story, it's pretty impossible to tell it in a linear fashion, and yet it does so to a certain degree. A big concept and also a big mystery of the story are the so-called cycles. 3 seasons, 3 cycles. And to simplify it a bit, a cycle means a specific time span in which time travel is possible. But while during those cycles or the 3 seasons of the show we jump back and forth between different time periods, we at the same time move forward chronologically in a day-by-day fashion. Each episode more or less shows us the events of one day. Sometimes that can include the next morning or the last night and so on, but as a general rule it's normally one day. One day in each of the depicted time periods. Another thing that creates this thread in the presentation that we can hold on to is the way each episode, with just 1 or 2 exceptions I think, is placing a melancholic song and montage at the end or just before the end. It functions as a strong emotional amplifier for all the new developments that were happening in the episode and how the characters reacted to them or are feeling right now. Those montages are always an absolute highlight, and the song selection is great. From the opening credits song Goodbye by Aber to the montage before the end, and the small new hints of the puzzle and slow character progressions, each episode is like a little artwork in itself, and though today's serialized storytelling can be oftentimes criticized for being more like an endless flow of information rather than a well-structured, thematic, focused unity, I think the episodes of Dark have enough uniqueness to stand as individual building blocks and not just cut out hours of a giant whole, which of course also the poignant episode titles direct to. And while there are several characters in the show, we also have one main protagonist, which is the high school student Jonas. It is mainly his journey. He functions a little bit as our alter ego, and our knowledge about what is going on is often tied to his knowledge. Since the perspective constantly changes to other characters as well, our overall knowledge is of course bigger than his, but I think the most crucial story developments and twists are experienced together by him and the audience. The story of Dark is almost absurdly complicated, but through this focus on Jonas we are able to cope with it and can understand it step by step and share our frustration and our surprise and reactions with him. Now, besides the day-by-day approach, it's also very interesting how the show introduces new time periods. I'm not sure if it follows this rule completely consistently, but usually when we get exposed to a new time period, we then spend the whole episode in that time. So the third episode of the series, minus some brief moments at the end, takes place in the 1980s. This gives the audience the chance to meet the younger versions of the characters and get at least a little bit familiar with what's going on in that time. Only then in the next episodes do we jump back and forth within an episode. When the 50s are introduced, we spend an entire episode there, and only in the following episodes the series asks us to keep track of more than one or even more than two time periods in one episode. And those transitions are then always cleverly marked by a ticking clock sound, which is simple and yet very effective. Something that sets Dark apart from Stranger Things, for example, is that it doesn't rely on nostalgia. Stranger Things is a heightened 80s retro celebration, and that's awesome, but it wouldn't fit in Dark. Of course, there are elements that are familiar and that can evoke a certain nostalgia, but those happen rather naturally. The way the different time periods are brought to life is downright perfect. The production design by Udo Kramer is great, and the costumes, cars, makeup, or just the way people talk, everything just fits and feels organic. And now concluding the spoiler-free segment, just a few words to the themes, which is of course time. Well, of course there's more to it. It's about mortality, about loss, about deceit and betrayal, about self-sacrifice, destiny, free will, and about the inevitability of all things. And with that, I want to finally move over to full spoilers. If you haven't watched Dark, just give it a try. I think it's one of the most fascinating shows ever created. I can totally get if it's not everyone's wheelhouse, and I think you should have an affinity for dark and slow and intentionally mysterious stories and approaches like this. But if you do like stuff like this, it should be one of the most unique experiences. I just said that Dark is about free will, and if we have free will, or if all our actions are already determined, if everything that we do is determined by other forces, by what we want, but don't have any say about. Dark shows us a deterministic world, and it's really not easy to wrap your head around it, but I found this concept to be one of the most fascinating ones of the entire series. Normally when we get time travel stories, we see people who are in full capacity of changing things around and therefore influence the future. But Dark shows us a world in which everything happens exactly the way it always does, because it always has for the things to be the way they are. When we start with this quite familiar paradox of Mikkel going back in time and therefore becoming the father of Jonas in the present, it was very neat because it was executed in a great way. Mikkel, who turns out to be Michael in the present, is a heartfelt and tragic character, and the father-son relationship and the entanglement with Hannah and Ulrich and everyone else is just so strong. But if I ever knew of all the crazy things that would happen later in the series. Dark is like the ultimate time travel paradox. It's like it looks at other time travel stories and asks, is that everything you are able to come up with? This has to be the most fucked up, batshit crazy time travel story of all time. And again, how they were able to come up with it and follow it through without any big mistakes is just beyond me. Before I talk about the finale, I just want to go through the whole series and talk about some of my personal highlights. And I will try to keep it short because I don't attempt to make the longest review in history. I think there are positives and there are negatives to binge watching. I actually think it can be pretty great to watch just one or maybe two episodes in a row and let them sink in. Think about it, let a day pass and then go back. And this is what I did with the first two seasons, and I think it amplified my enjoyment of how Dark is able to slowly but steadily increase the scope and the stakes. The twist with Mikkel being Michael was great. The revelation that the stranger is actually Jonas was even better, even though you could see it coming. But when that first season ends and we end up with Jonas in a post-apocalyptic future, I was completely flashed. I honestly didn't expect something like this. I think for the reason that this is also a German series. It just never never occurred to me that we would see anything like that in there. I loved the first season, even though I think it has some flaws. The acting in the very beginning felt a bit rough sometimes, and while I applaud the way the story is structured, it nevertheless felt a bit random at times how one scene transitioned to the next, or why we see specific things at the time we see them. It's something that always stayed a little bit with the series, but in a narrative this big, I think it's excusable. But in the first season, upon my first watch, there were moments where the dramatic effect not always completely landed, because some of the characters were still too foreign to me. Especially the relationship between Jonas and Martha, because it's more or less over when the series begins. From the beginning it was something from the past, and therefore I had a harder time to invest in it at first. Which was a strange foundation when you think that this is the emotional core of the whole story. But as the series progressed, it got better and better for me. After the first season I was still a bit hesitant to call it a masterpiece, because I had a lot of questions. I mean, you have a lot of questions until the very end, and even after the end, because it's such a mindfuck, but I mean more questions about the believability of the world, which is probably why I was so on board with season 2, which I think is the best of the 3. The show neatly connected a lot of dots and also not just eliminated my disbeliefs, but often just blew my mind with the reasons for it. For example, I wondered how and why Mikkel, a little boy, should go into a dark cave all alone and then push a big door away to get through. Let alone that there is such a strange construction in that cave. That there is a mysterious time portal is one thing, but a door with an inscription and a tunnel, that was a bit too much. But to learn that it was actually Jonas himself who led Mikkel through there, and the idea that the tunnels were built many years ago, even before the portal existed. The introduction of Sigmundus Est and Adam, this secret sect-like organization that is fighting for the domination of time travel. Holy shit, and I think only Dark is able to pull off more or less the same twist twice. First, that a stranger is Jonas from the future, and then that Adam is also Jonas. For me, this is without a doubt one of the best twists in all fiction. The idea that our protagonist is not just the good guy, but somehow also its very own adversary, and that because of the rules of this world he will become that person. It's so fascinating to try to wrap your head around that. Though of course Dark plays very cleverly with our understanding and predictions of which characters are evil, which are good, which are in between, and of course it's not as easy and clear as it seems at the beginning. And it also fascinated me to no end that because of the existence of the stranger and Adam, we knew that Jonas would spend his entire life to unravel this giant time travel nut. Dark has 26 episodes, and a few exceptions aside, that also means that we get to know the story through those 26 days that are depicted in those episodes. Yet the whole narrative, the whole time span of the entire story is more than 100 years. How we are going further back in time, how Jonas is transported to 1921, and even then there are already people there who later turn out to be characters we already knew. Dark kept surprising me in all the right ways. And I guess the biggest and best surprise for me, and that ties to the Adam reveal, is how everything is about these 4 families that live in Winden. The idea that our protagonists aren't thrown into the story about some strangers they have to confront, some people from the future or the past, but that they are themselves most of those people. That is such a great idea for a time travel story. That we start at this point in 2019 without knowing that the world we are about to explore is already messed up to no end. That the Mikkel/Michael reveal or paradox is only the beginning. I think it's remarkable storytelling, and as the title suggests, it lets the audience in the dark, but gives us just the right dose of information to try to solve this giant puzzle and keep investing into these characters and their crazy story. Season 2 is downright perfect for me, and each episode reveals new crazy stuff and goes deeper into the whole free will idea and what Adam's plan might be and who is telling the truth. Jonas has to be one of the most tragic characters ever written, destined or doomed to become Adam, losing everything dear to him, and all his life trying to change the course of history. And the ongoing hope of Jonas that he will be able to change something, and the ever-increasing understanding that it can't happen. At the same time, season 2 worked much better for me on an emotional level. Probably because by that point we have spent a lot more time with all these characters, but also because I really like the way the character of Egon is portrayed both in the 1950s and 80s. For me, he became the emotional anchor of season 2, and to see how his daughter Claudia is developing into a key figure in this whole time travel affair and how she is working up her damaged relationship with her father, This really affected me. And Ulrich, who was already a key player in the first season, has such strong moments in the second. And this is also what I mean by slow burn. The emotional weight of the discovery that he spends 33 years of his life just rotting away in a mental institution because he was trying to get back his son. That is so powerful, and the payoff when he finally gets to him. His son Mikkel hasn't aged at all for us, but his father is now this very old man. This is why I think time travel stories can have such a great emotional impact. It's similar to that Interstellar scene in which Matthew McConaughey gets all those messages from his daughter, who just completely grew up in what was just an instant for him. Time travel stories can confront us with these crazy constellations and situations, and they can also externalize conflicts and emotions that otherwise just happen internally, like confronting your own self, or saying goodbye or sorry to a person you know is already dead. Another highlight in season 2 was the character of Clausen, who again put the finger directly to the stuff that I found a bit peculiar and too unrealistic in season 1. He's someone from outside of Winden, and when he wonders how it is possible that so many people who grew up in Winden stayed there and didn't move away, I thought to myself, exactly. Of course, again, I didn't know at that point how really everything is connected. Clausen also brought at least some humor into the show, which I thought gave it just that tiny bit of levity that it needed. I was honestly expecting something more about Clausen in season 3, but as it turns out, his story was complete, and that's also okay. Now, before we are going over to season 3, I want to point out one single episode. Something that can always be very special in series is when there are episodes that do stuff a little bit different than you are used to. In the second season that happens with episode 6, Ein unendlicher Kreis, an endless cycle. When we jump back to the day that Jonas' father committed suicide, and we see how Jonas is observing himself and his friends, and we see a world that seemingly was still at ease. It's a beautiful hour of television and maybe the best episode in the entire series. Season 3 has also a very special and different episode which fills in a lot of holes. It is episode 7, Zwischen der Zeit, Between the Time. And in that one we witness several events and progressions from early 1888 to 2054. It was an episode I was waiting for, because while I always found it fascinating to try to imagine how exactly all the characters got to their older selves, I also wonder just how realistic it is that probably not much happened in between the times that the show is actually depicting. Like, did Jonas just hang around for 33 years until he became the stranger? This episode is at least shining some light on that, and it gives us a deeper understanding of the progression of time and of the relationships between the characters. Jonas, Noah and Claudia did spend a lot of time together, and in light of that, their actions throughout the series gained even more weight. Overall, Baran, Odar and Jantje Friese did succeed in giving their remarkable series a good finale. I think of the 3 seasons it is the one I have most issues with, and I'm a bit torn about certain aspects, but it doesn't really diminish the overall series at all. The big twist at the end of the second season was the existence of another world. Up until that point, Dark was strongly indicating that there was only this one world and there are no possible parallel universes. And to be completely honest, I was definitely worried about that new development because I was afraid it would take away from all the seriousness and weight of what we saw so far, and also that it would simply get too convoluted and bizarre. Now, having seen the end, I do think they told a fascinating story overall, but I'm still not completely on board with it. The very first episode of season 3 is titled Déjà Vu, and we basically go back to the very beginning of the show and kind of relive parts of the first season. Because now Jonas travels to that alternative dimension, a world where he was never born. And it's really awesome and also fun to see all the little alterations and also how it is presented. The very first episode of Dark has this great long continuous shot that establishes the busy family life of the Nielsens. And though the family constellation is different in this alternative world, we still get it shown in one long continuous shot. There's another one of those shots when we see the teenagers in the school. Again, just like in the first episode of the first season. Dark is always obsessed with repetitions like these, with loops and cycles. Everything repeats in an endless vicious cycle and nobody seems to be able to escape. Or while some try to escape, or as we find out for certain now, want to destroy everything, total annihilation, they still have to make sure that everything happens exactly as it always have, to come to a certain point in time when they, meaning Adam, believe are able to put an end to it all. But But while the introduction of this alternative world is interesting, I find it nevertheless a bit problematic in the overarching dramatic structure that it happens so late in the game, and I felt the first half of Season 3 has some pacing problems, and the second world and its characters simply can't get as much attention and time as is maybe needed for them to have the right impact. Our involvement still remains primarily with World 1 and those characters that we have seen for 2 seasons now, and the show knows that too. But somehow I think in this fight or conflict between Adam, Sigmundus Est, and the goal to destroy everything on one side, and on the other Eva, Erit Lux and the strive to keep this giant knot alive, somehow I think we should be more involved with the latter as well. But that wasn't easy for me. But that being said, there are some genuine what the fuck moments, and when episode 7 opens up with the scientist and watchmaker Tannhaus directly explaining Schrödinger's cat to the audience, I had the biggest smile on my face. Tannhaus has always been an interesting character in the show. His book Eine Reise durch die Zeit, A Journey Through Time, was one of the many important objects of the series that changed its owner more than once, and that was crucial to the invention and further development of the time machines in the series. And that it is him now where everything leads back to is both surprising and yet perfectly fitting. It was actually already his voiceover about the relativity of time that opened up the very first episode of the series. That it was his invention of a time machine in an unknown third and original dimension that led to the existence of the other 2 worlds is a wonderful closing revelation. Certain characters were always the main protagonists from the get-go, but Dark also surprised us with some heavy shifts of importance throughout. At first, nobody would really assume that Claudia, of all people, would be one of the most crucial figures in all of this, or how much Charlotte takes the spotlight in Season 2, or Egon, or Elisabeth, and that Tannhaus was always there, but we didn't pay too much attention to him, only fits in that tradition, I think. And the reason why he created a time machine is of course as old as humanity itself, I guess, because he wanted to bring someone back from the dead, because he couldn't deal with the loss of his son and his family, and of course also because he wanted to make things up to his son. He needed a second chance. I admit at first I was a bit baffled by this whole revelation because it did feel a bit too much like a familiar mainstream movie story trope. But when you let it sink in, it's just too human not to work. And it ties to the many, many family conflicts the series is dealing with. Ulrich, the father who is trying everything he can to find his son. Katharina, the mother who is doing the same thing. The sheer amount of parents that get killed by their own children in a twisted way of fate. Egon, who gets killed by his mother Claudia. Hannah, who gets killed by Jonas. Or Jonas, who has to endure the suicide of his father Michael. And Katharina, who gets killed by her own mother. It's a fucked up world, and I think it's beautiful and yet thought-provoking how Dark is solving all of that in the very end. And I also really like the idea that Tannhaus's pain and his struggle created these 2 messed up universes, which can maybe be read as his pain and inner conflict as well. 2 worlds in which everything led to destruction and everlasting torment that can't be escaped. Dark is such a weird and unique show. It begins with the suicide of Mikkel or Michael, and it ends basically with the suicide of 2 worlds. It's a weird sacrifice, and it's so fresh in my mind that I'm not yet completely sure how to feel about it. But I do think I'm at ease with it, because those worlds led to the apocalypse and they really are filled with not much but pain and suffering. And in a fascinating way, the time machine of Tannhaus created these 2 worlds, and the end of those 2 worlds are what saved his son and his family in the end, because it needed Jonas and Martha to travel to that original world to stop the accident from happening. The son comes back to his father, and the father will never even know that he's creating a time machine, and with it those 2 worlds and many lifetimes of suffering were the reason for that. And that is just such bittersweet poetry. Now, the way Jonas and Martha travel there reminded me at the surreal library sequence in Interstellar, and it did feel a bit tacky to me. And somehow a series that wasn't at all like Back to the Future became a little bit like that in the very end. It was also strange how Jonas and Martha just went to the exact right moment almost magically. But maybe someone just needs to explain it to me, and maybe I just have to get used to it. And with Hannah in the original world telling about her dream and how everything just went dark and that was okay and peaceful, it is indeed a beautiful and forgiving end. I won't lie, I'm still wrapping my head around the idea how Jonas and Martha were able to change things when the whole series was so adamant with that, but it probably makes sense. I don't know. The whole thing about determinism and that everything is happening exactly as it always does and that the characters really can change things always had a nice meta touch to me as well. This is a work of fiction, and that means that the filmmakers or showrunners have written everything the way we see it on screen. And I always felt as if the characters and their world are a bit like slaves to the will of the author, who is deciding upon their fate. And maybe that's silly, but I always liked that idea. The characters can't escape the series, and they have to endure in front of our eyes and live through this drama of theirs. The death of the cat depends on our observation. As long as we don't look, it is both dead and alive at the same time. And we just looked at the series, and the world was split into 3, and in the end it was made whole again. But maybe it does exist in both these states in all eternity. I don't know. Maybe I'm just rambling nonsense here, but that's one of Dark's best qualities. That it makes your head spin and makes you theorize about the story, about the characters, about the themes, and also about such amazing physical and philosophical concepts. Now, before I end this review, which is the longest one I have ever done, I do want to bring up some things that I didn't like that much about the last season, or where I thought it was stumbling a little bit. With a mystery show like this, you kind of need to keep the mystery going, and in the worst cases that can become really artificial and frustrating, to the point where it turns into a parody of itself. That was my biggest problem with Lost in its last seasons. Nobody really talked with each other, nobody could answer simple questions, and the series always kept introducing new characters who seemingly had all the important answers until it turned out that they don't, and there's yet someone else who is supposed to have those. Now thank God, or rather thank the showrunners, Dark never goes completely off the rails in that regard, but I am afraid it comes a little bit too close for my taste here and there. With a title like that, it is to be expected that we will be kept in the dark about a lot of things. And that's good, because the information that we get fuel our imagination, and when done in a clever way, and Dark is clever about a lot of things, it can be a fascinating and rewarding experience. A sentence that is repeated several times in the last season is, "What we know is a drop. What we don't know is an ocean." And that can of course be applied to the whole series. Unfortunately though, it's not the only sentence or the only words that keep getting repeated. And the binge watching probably made it even more apparent, but there are so many buzzwords getting thrown around that it got borderline ridiculous for me. If you would make a drinking game where you need to take a sip whenever the words apocalypse, world, beginning, end, connected or not are spoken, you wouldn't be drunk, you would be dead. After so many episodes, it got a bit tiresome that those important figures like Adam or now also Eva kept on saying stuff that we already have heard so many times without really revealing too much new things. And at the beginning of the review I also said that the heavy symbolism is great, but it can also work to the show's detriment. What I meant is that the way it is presented is great, but it does wear off and it can cross the line of becoming just too much. The first time we are being introduced to the church, or the hidden layer under the church of Sigmund Est, how Jonas is arriving there, the architecture, the painting on the wall, and that mysterious figure of Adam, it is super captivating and memorable. But with that many back and forth between times and places, it does get a bit too on the nose and maybe too heavy to be taken completely serious at times. The striking clothes, the same waiting posture before the painting, the mysterious monologues, and so on. It all got a bit much for me, which is why I'm also happy that they decided to go with just 3 seasons to wrap everything up. Which of course also ties back to the series' obsession with the number 3, that came full circle in the end with the revelation that there are indeed 3 worlds. 3 worlds, 3 seasons, 3 cycles, 33 years, and so on. And of course the new mysterious character, who turns out to be the son of Jonas and Martha, is also mostly appearing in 3 different age forms at the same time. As the son of Jonas and Martha, he is of course also the son of Adam and Eva. He is like the unknown forbidden fruit in the Bible, and this whole idea that Jonas and Martha created everything in those 2 worlds is fascinating, or rather mind-boggling. And with that son, I'm honestly not sure if I would have preferred to learn more about him. At first I thought an episode where we see his life and how he was constantly sent through time by Eva to put everything in its place would have been interesting. But on second thought, I'm not sure if it's maybe better to let it remain a mystery. But the thing that I don't quite get or believe is just how Claudia was able to figure everything out in the end. I think it's a great decision to make her the person who mediates between Adam and Eva, Jonas and Martha, and that she literally commits suicide by killing herself from the other world is also pretty disturbed and poignant. By the way, I'm not sure if it's just here in Austria or if it's the general parental guidance, but for me, Dark is labeled on Netflix as age 16 and up with the remark sex and suicide. That's just too good. That Regina is the key to everything has a lot of power, because like Regina's cancer, those two worlds degenerated like cancer tumors, and only without them she can live in the original world. Without that not devouring everything. But how exactly Claudia is able to know about the existence of that original world, I don't know. To deduct everything just from her acquaintance with this and the second world's Tannhaus and concepts about the universe, I'm not so sure about that. But again, maybe someone knows better, or maybe I just have to let that part go. In any case, those are just minor complaints. I don't think season 3 is as neatly constructed as the first two, and sometimes it stumbles a little bit, but overall they brought everything together in a fascinating way, and for me, Dark stands as one of the best science fiction series and stories ever created. And I know that I haven't even really talked about all the different actors, but let me just say that they are all pretty fantastic. And of course the dozens of little details or big symbols, but there's just too much to talk about here. So in German I'd say, der Anfang ist das Ende und das Ende ist der Anfang. Was sonst? Aber im Ernst, ich habe wirklich schon zu viel geredet. I give Dark 9 out of 10. It's more like 8.7, but I don't do that.
Alles ist miteinander verbunden. Zukunft, Vergangenheit und Gegenwart.
Alright, that's it like always. Comment below and let me know what you think about Dark. Are you happy with the ending? What is your favorite season? Who is your favorite character? What is your favorite moment? Stuff like that. You can hit me up on Twitter, Instagram and Letterboxd simply at @JimmyCage. And if you enjoyed this super long episode, please give me a thumbs up, share, subscribe, whatever you like. And make sure you hit that bell for all I have to tell.